Hello friend, welcome to the Galactic HFY Story, where stories and science combine to create the magic. With real human voices, no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So please subscribe my channel and press the bell icon for the latest updates and get ready for the real experience of science. Let's start.
There is a moment, and every soldier across every species knows it, when the difference between a leader and a coward becomes visible.
A leader and a coward.
Not in the speeches. Not in the medals or the war rooms or the official debriefs that get filed and forgotten in some bureaucrat's queue on Veth Prime. In the food line. We had been observing the humans for 11 days before the incident.
Monitor all sectors.
Cataloging. Rating. Filing our little reports with our little checkboxes. Are the humans compliant?
Our little checkboxes.
Are the humans dangerous? Are the humans capable of operating within joint force structures without eating someone?
We move together.
Standard questions for a non-standard species.
Are the humans dangerous?
I had my opinions. I kept them in my personal log, which I dictated every night in a voice slightly too quiet for my bunkmate Osek to hear, because Osek had opinions about my opinions and I had limited patience for Osek. But I had not expected this. I had not expected a half-starved, filth-crusted, battle-worn human soldier who had not eaten in 31 hours, whose hands had a tremor she kept hiding by pressing them flat against her thighs, to reach the front of the food distribution line after everything she had been through, and step aside. Just step aside. Point to the cluster of small ones, the orphan young from the Veth civilian convoy, children who had been shuffled to the back because that is where non-combatants go, that is protocol, that is how things are done, and say, in that flat, exhausted human voice, let them eat first.
Point to the cluster.
I stopped writing.
The orphaned young.
I looked at Osek.
Convoy.
Osek looked at me. Neither of us said a word, because neither of us had a word for what we had just seen. We had a word for sacrifice.
The readings are spiking.
We had a word for strategy.
Now before it's too late.
We had a word for performance, for political theater, for the calculated kindness that buys loyalty. We did not have a word for something done quietly, in a muddy field, when no one important was watching, with nothing to gain and a 31-hour hunger burning through every cell in your body. I opened my log back up. I deleted the entire assessment I had written.
Neither of us had a word for
and
what we
I
had just
started
seen.
over. This is what I recorded. I have changed nothing. Field Assessment Log, Provisional Attachment, Joint Humanitarian Corridor, Sector 9 Mireth logged by Subcommander Velathorin, 3rd Behavioral Sciences, Veth Compact Day 11 of Observation Sequence. Personal Notation Flag,
For
active.
the calculated kindness.
This
that
is
buys
not for the
loyalty.
official record. This is for me. I was on my third cup of processed grain slurry, which the humans, with their gift for either optimism or self-deception, had labeled field coffee when Sergeant First Class Marin Doss walked into the distribution tent and changed something in me I hadn't known was sitting loose. The slurry was terrible. It always was. I drank it anyway because the act of holding the cup gave my hands something to do while I observed, and if my hands were not occupied they would fidget with the edge of my uniform collar until I'd rubbed a raw patch into the skin beneath, which Osek had pointed out twice and which I deeply resented him for noticing. I noted 0614 hours.
Sector details.
Distribution tent.
Anomalies.
Human DOS enters.
Results incoming.
She didn't look like a person who'd spent 11 consecutive days in active corridor operations. She looked like something the corridor had partially consumed and, then, spat back out on a point of technicality. Left boot taped at the toe with what appeared to be packaging material repurposed from a medical supply crate. Right sleeve gone entirely, replaced by a strip of what might once have been a signal scarf, knotted just below her shoulder. Her hair, humans have that, the head fiber, I still wasn't accustomed to it, was pulled back in a configuration that defied my understanding of structural integrity.
That's better.
And, the hands. Flat against her thighs as she walked.
When Sergeant First Class
Not
Marin
swinging,
Doss
not
walked
loose,
into
not the easy
distribution.
loping stride I'd catalogued from her twice in the field. Pressed flat. Trembling beneath the pressure of being
I
pressed
drank it
flat.
anyway because the act of
I
holding
wrote,
the cup
subject
gave my
exhibits
hands something to do
micro-concealment
while I
behavior upper limb motor distress.
observed.
Cross-reference,
If my hands were
31-hour
not,
fast,
they would fidget
confirmed
with the
via
edge of my
logistics
uniform
manifest.
Until I
Caloric
rubbed the raw
deficit
patch into the
significant.
skin beneath.
Physical status, compromised. Then, I
Osek
took a
had
sip of
pointed out
terrible
twice,
coffee and
which I
watched her join the
deeply
food line.
resented him for noticing.
The distribution tent had been set up by the Veth Compact logistics team, which meant it followed compact protocol, which meant it was organized with the algorithmic elegance that compact protocol always promised and the grinding inflexibility that compact protocol always delivered. Combat personnel to the front. Support and non-combat to the middle.
With what appeared to be
Civilians
packaging
and
material
non-combatants
repurposed
to
from
the
a
rear,
medical.
prioritized by relative utility to ongoing operations. I had written a note about this on day 3. I had submitted it through the appropriate channels. The appropriate channels had thanked me for my input and then done absolutely nothing, which was the appropriate channels doing exactly what the appropriate channels were designed to
still
do.
wasn't accustomed to it.
So the orphans
Was
were
pulled
at the
back in a
back.
configuration that defied
11 of
my
them.
understanding.
Veth children, displaced
You
from the
can't
civilian
escape
convoy
this.
that had been hit in the
Look at
Mireth
what
Pass
you've
3
become.
days before the joint unit even arrived in sector. Ages ranging from what I estimated as 3 to 14 by Veth developmental standards.
Trembling beneath the pressure.
They had been absorbed into the camp because there was nowhere else for them to go and because abandoning them was a
Subject
level of
exhibits
institutional
microconcealed
callousness that even
behavior
compact
without
protocol
living
hadn't
stress.
quite managed to codify into a checkbox. They sat in a cluster near the rear tent pole. The oldest, the 14-year-old, Taith, I'd learned his name because he kept appearing near my observation post with a quality of determined hovering that suggested he was either
The
curious about me or
distribution tent
planning
had
to
been
steal
set up by
something,
the Veth
and I
compact
respected
logistics
both
team.
possibilities, had his arms around 2 of the smallest ones.
Followed compact protocol.
Waiting. The way the very young and the very old and the very powerless wait,
Movement
not
was
with patience,
organized with
which
the
is a choice,
algorithmic
but
elegance
with the
that
suspended
compact
animation of
protocol
people
always
who have stopped expecting things to happen on any particular schedule. I noted, Orphan Group. Rear position. Estimated wait, 40 minutes, current service rate. I took another sip of my slurry. Doss moved through the line. I watched her the way I watched all the humans, methodically, with the mild voyeuristic discomfort of a scientist who keeps forgetting the specimens or watching back. She said something to the soldier ahead of her that made him snort laugh, a sound like a ruptured pressure valve, and he turned and punched her lightly in the shoulder in a gesture that my cultural glossary cross-referenced as affectionate assault, non-hostile,
The appropriate
pack
channels
bonding
had
function,
thanked me
see
for my
also,
input
hazing,
and then
play,
done
territorial
absolutely
greeting.
Nothing.
She grinned. Or something adjacent to a grin, the human face does that, layers things, wears 5 expressions over each other like strata, so that what reads as grin also reads as exhaustion and, also reads as I will be fine and, also reads as something I didn't have a word for in my glossary yet. She moved up the line. Pressed her hands flat again when she
Before
thought
the
no
joint
one was
unit even
watching.
Arrived in sector.
I was always watching. That was literally my assignment. Here is a thing about the Veth food distribution system that I had not appreciated until I spent
The
11 days
signature is
embedded
right
in a
here.
field
You see
operation.
it, faint
It is
glows.
designed to be
That's our
efficient,
entry point.
not
Let's
fair.
go. Copy that.
These are different things. I understand this in the abstract. I had apparently not understood it in the specific. In the abstract, prioritizing combat personnel ensures operational
in a cluster
readiness,
near the
which
rear
ensures
tent
mission success, which ensures the protection of non-combatants, which benefits everyone in a kind of long arc transactional way.
Roger, moving.
In the specific,
Stay
the
sharp.
children at the back of the line were hungry right now, and the math of operational readiness was not currently visible to them in any form they could hold on to. Taith had his arms around the 2 smallest ones. Doss had reached the front of the line. The logistics officer, subspecialist Pyarth, who ran the distribution point with the focused martyrdom of someone who believed deeply in his own thanklessness, was already reaching for her ration pack. She looked at him.
Which is a
Then,
choice.
she turned. Turned all the way around, not the casual half-turn of someone looking for a dropped item, but fully, deliberately, until she was facing the back of the tent.
I know.
Until she was looking at the cluster of children near the tent pole. Taith with his arms around the small ones.
Weight, 40
The middle-sized ones sitting in a row of varying stages of trying not to look like they were waiting. I stopped writing. I do not know why I stopped. My hand just didn't move.
Advance to the ridge.
The stylus stayed over the log sheet.
Keep formation, eyes open.
I sat there with my terrible coffee halfway to my mouth. She looked at them for maybe 4 seconds. Then, she
said
stepped
something
out of
to
the line.
soldier ahead of her that made him
Stepped
snort
aside.
laugh.
All the way to the edge of the service table, out of the queue, not holding her position, not hedging out. Completely. She gestured to the soldier behind her to move up, and he did, automatically, the way bodies in lines respond to motion. She pointed at the cluster of children. Her voice when she spoke was quiet.
Or something adjacent.
Not
to a
performative
grid.
quiet, the
human
kind you
face
use
does
when you
that.
want people to
Layers
notice how
things.
quiet you're being. Just quiet.
5 expressions over
The way
each
you'd
other
say
like
something
strata.
you'd already decided before you opened your mouth. Let them eat first. Pyeth stared at her. The soldier behind her stared at her. I stared at her. She was still pressing her hands flat against her thighs. The tremor was visible from where I sat if you knew what to look for, and I knew what to look for.
Pressed her hands
Pyeth
flat
said,
again,
Sergeant,
she thought no
protocol
one was
assigns priority by I know what protocol assigns. Not rude. Not angry. Just the voice of someone who has heard the argument before and has already made peace with overriding it. I'm not asking you to change the protocol. I'm asking you to serve the kids while I wait. Different thing. There was a pause where I
11
could hear the
days
field
embedded
coffee
in a
heating
field
elements
operation.
cycling in the
It was
corner and
designed
a
to be
distant sound that
efficient,
might have been
not
artillery
fair.
and might have been thunder, because in Sector 9 Mareth everything sounded like everything else.
Clear. We must
Pyeth looked at her.
I understand this in the
He looked at
abstract.
his manifest. He looked at her again. She looked back at him with an expression that I would not have been able to decode on day 1, but that by day 11 I understood meant, I have more patience for this pause than you do. I have been patient through considerably worse than this pause. The pause is not going to work on me. Pyeth reached for a ration pack. He moved to the end of the table. He started toward the children. What happened next, and, I want to be precise about this, I want to get the sequence right because the sequence matters, was not a scene. It was not a moment. It was not one of those instances you could frame and hang and label act of heroism, field conditions, joint humanitarian corridor. It was just a series of small things happening in a
Dawson
row.
reached the front of the line.
Taith stood up when Pyeth approached. He was 14, which by Veth developmental standards put him in early adolescent range, which meant he had the characteristic combination of not quite adult wariness and not quite child hope that is the most exhausting thing to observe because you can feel both of them fighting each other in every micro expression.
Yes, sir.
He was wary.
Advancing.
Stay sharp.
He straightened up because he was wary, and the two smallest ones tucked in closer to his sides because they felt intense. Pyeth held out the ration pack. Taith looked at it.
Looks clear.
Looked at Pyeth.
Shadows.
Looked at the front of the line, where Doss had stepped aside, and found her immediately, the way displaced people find the person who moved for them,
Until she was
with the
looking at the
specific
cluster
optical
of children
accuracy of
with the
someone
tent
checking to confirm this is real. She wasn't looking at him.
Teth with his arms around
She was
the small
talking to
one.
the soldier beside her. The punched shoulder one.
The middle-sized one
Saying
sitting
something
in a
with her
row of
hands,
varying
the flat-pressed
stages of
position had broken open into gesticulation, the tremor briefly forgotten, or overridden, and the soldier was laughing again with that pressure valve sound. Not watching.
My hand just
Not performing.
move.
I wrote, subject DOS. Not performing. Then, I stopped, because that was the thing, wasn't it? That was the whole thing right there in 2 words and, I didn't know what to do with it. Taith took the ration pack. He sat down. He didn't open it. He waited until all the other children had theirs. Pyeth had apparently made a decision somewhere in the middle of this and was distributing with a focused efficiency I hadn't seen from him before, and then, only then, once the smallest 2 had theirs open and were eating, Taith opened his own.
not hedging. Out.
I had my coffee cup pressed against my mouth. I was not drinking it. I was using it as a physical barrier between my face and the room because I did not know what my face was doing and I didn't want Osek to
The way
see it.
bodies and lines respond to
Osek was
mine.
next to me. I could feel him not saying anything in a way that meant he was
this
very
coffee smells
deliberately not
amazing.
saying anything.
Let's see if it's still hot.
I deeply resented him for that too.
Her voice was
Doss ate when she finally got to the front of the line. She ate with the focused mechanical quality of someone refueling a machine, efficient, unromantic, standing up because the bench nearest her was
The way
occupied
you'd
and
say
she didn't
something
bother
you'd
to find
already
another one.
decided before you opened
She
your
ate
mouth.
standing up with her back to the tent pole, watching the tent entrance, which was a habit I'd documented in her at least 8 times and which I'd cross-referenced with several studies on vigilance behavior and
not be
situational
caged.
threat assessment in combat experienced individuals. Except it wasn't that, right now. She wasn't watching the tent entrance for threats. She was watching the tent entrance because that was just where her eyes went when she didn't have anything specific to look at. The body's
Move forward,
idle position.
quietly.
Copy that.
Standing guard did nothing in
Something's out
particular.
there.
The tremor in her hands was gone by the time she finished eating. She put the empty ration packaging in her thigh pocket, not in the disposal bin. I'd noted this behavior on day 6 and filed it under resource retention, scarcity conditioning, or habitual storage, hadn't settled on a conclusion, and turned to go. She passed the children's cluster on the way out.
There was a pause where I could
She
hear
didn't
the
stop.
coffee heating element
She
cycling
didn't
in.
speak.
The corner
She
and the distant
glanced.
sound that
Just
might
a
have been
glance, the
artillery,
kind that
might
takes
have
in
been
a scene
thunder.
and confirms it without demanding
Because
acknowledgement.
in Sector 9 Mirith, everything
The two
sounded
smallest
like
ones were
everything
still
else.
eating. Taith was watching Doss with the look. I knew this look by now, this specific look on this specific face, that meant he was committing something to a memory he intended to keep.
He looked at his manifest.
She walked out of the tent. The flap closed behind her. I put down my coffee. I looked at my log sheet. I had written, over the last 11
looked back
days,
at him
a
with an
combined total of
expression that I would not
approximately
have been able to
43 pages of
decode from
behavioral
the
analysis on the human contingent.
Target locked.
I
Fire
had
on my
grids.
mark. Copy. Weapon charge.
I had
ready.
cross-references. I had a lovely color-coded matrix that Osek had admired and, then, suggested was, perhaps, slightly excessive, at which point I had given him a lengthy explanation of why thoroughness was not a flaw and, he had gone back to his own work with the expression of a person who had learned something they hadn't asked to learn. 43 pages. None of them contained what I had just watched. Because what I had just watched didn't fit into any of my grids. It wasn't strategic, there was no tactical advantage to feeding the children first. It
What
wasn't
happened
political.
next?
Doss had
And I
no
wanna
rank
be
relationship with
precise
anyone
about
in that
this.
tent that made this a calculated gesture.
I want to get the
It wasn't
sequence right
performed,
because
she had
the
spent an
sequence
active
matters.
40 seconds
It was
making
not a
sure she
scene.
wasn't watching the outcome. It was
not
just
a
I kept
moment.
coming back to the hands. The flat-pressed hands. The concealed tremor. The 31 hours. The way she'd eaten standing up, mechanical,
Field
not making a
conditions,
production
joint
of either the
humanitarian
hunger or
corridor.
the satisfaction. A person who hadn't eaten in 31
It was
hours,
just a
who was
series of
actively
small
hiding a
things
physiological
happening in a
distress
row.
response, who had spent 11 consecutive days in operations
Ted
I wouldn't
stood
have
up
lasted
when
3
Pirate
days in,
approached.
had reached the front of a food line and stepped out of it. Not for
He was
effect.
14.
Not
which by
for
VEF
audience.
Developmental standards.
Just because
put
the
him in
children were
early
at the back
adolescent
end,
range,
the children were
which
hungry
meant he
and,
had the
that was
characteristic
apparently,
combination
in the
of not
operational
quite adult
calculus of
worries
Sergeant First
and
Class
not
Marin
quite
Doss, a
child.
thing that needed
Hope
correcting.
That is the most exhausting
I deleted
thing to
my
observe
43
because you
pages.
can feel both of them.
I did not delete them
fighting
because
each
they were wrong.
Perimeter clear. Advance.
They were methodologically
Rolling
sound.
fields ahead. Eyes open.
I deleted them because I understood, sitting in that
straightened
tent
up
with a cup
because
of
he was
terrible
wary.
processed grain slurry going cold in my hand, that they were answering a question I no longer found interesting. The question I had been assigned to answer, are humans compatible with joint force operations? The question I now found I could not stop thinking about. What is the correct word for someone who steps out of a food line for children they have never met, when no one important is watching, when they are trembling with hunger, and
Looked at the
then
front of the
does not
line
stay to watch
where
them eat?
Doss had stepped aside.
I did not have that word in VEF. I was fairly
found
sure
her
we
in
didn't have the thing, either.
The way displaced
Osek
people
spoke.
find the person who moved
I had forgotten he was there.
specific optical
This was a
accuracy of someone
testament to how
checking
thoroughly
confirm
I had
this is
managed to
real.
disappear into my
She
own
wasn't
head.
looking.
Because Osek is not a small presence, he is a tall, broad-framed VEF officer who wears his uniform with the specific neatness of someone engaged in constant low-level passive aggression toward the concept of entropy, and, forgetting Osek was in a room was generally not something I was
The
capable
tremor
of.
briefly forgotten
He said, "You deleted your assessment." I'm aware.
or overridden.
I
and the
watched
soldier
you
was
delete it.
laughing again with that pressure
Also
valve sound.
aware. Pause. The heating element cycled. The artillery or thunder made its ambiguous sound in the distance. Are you going to write a new one? I looked at the tent entrance. The
That
flap
the
was
whole
still.
thing right there in
She'd
two
been
words,
gone
and
4 minutes.
I didn't know what to do with it.
Yes, I said. What will it say? I picked up my coffee. Still terrible. Marginally cooler than before.
Open it.
I don't know yet, I said. I need to think about it. Osek made a sound that meant he was deciding not to say something. I counted this as a small victory and a significant personal development.
I hadn't seen from.
Here is what I know about the VEF children, specifically, Taith is 14. His parents were in the convoy. I knew this because I had read the casualty manifest on day 8 and, then, spent 20 minutes staring at the wall of my bunk thinking about the word manifest, which is a very clean word for a very unclean thing. The two smallest, I learned their names later, Voss and Mira, 3 and 5 respectively, were not his siblings. They were just small, and he was just the oldest, and that was apparently sufficient in the mathematics Taith was operating by. I thought about this.
Coffee out here in the wild.
I thought about Doss and Tafe,
Cheers to the
and
simple
the
things.
specific way they both operated by a mathematics. I didn't have a framework for a mathematics that kept arriving at someone is worse off than me, therefore as if the therefore were obvious, as if the conclusion were predetermined. In Veth Compact Doctrine, resource prioritization in field conditions follows a clear hierarchy, combat capability first, because capability protects all other resources.
Finally got to the front of the line.
It is logical. It has been modeled.
She ate with
The models bear it out.
Quality of someone.
I had always found it logical.
Efficient.
I sat in that tent for another 20 minutes
Standing
after
up
Doss
because the
left,
bench
watching the
nearest her was
children eat,
occupied,
watching
and she
Pyeth
didn't
work
bother
through the
to
rest of
find.
the line with an efficiency that seemed to have absorbed some new quality it hadn't had before, a slight softening in the shoulders, a half-second of additional care when he handed out the packs, and I thought about the compact models. The models assumed a closed system. They assumed the primary cost of feeding non-combatants first was a reduction in the combat capacity of those who waited. The models did not account for what it did to Pyeth's shoulders. The models did not account for the way the soldier who had punched Doss in the shoulder, I checked my log, his name was Corporal Adrian Yas, spent the next hour on double-focused perimeter work with a quality of attention I hadn't clocked from him in 11 days.
Move out,
The
squad.
models did not account for Tafe.
Lead, moving.
Tafe, who was 14, who was watching everything, who would remember this,
Howard becomes visible.
who was committing it to a memory he intended to keep, and who would, someday, be old enough that the memory could become a model. I opened a new assessment page. I wrote at the top, preliminary observation, human behavioral pattern, category unlabeled. Cross-reference request, none. Reason, no existing category applicable.
filing our little report.
I sat there for a while. Then, I wrote, the human did not calculate.
We must go.
Or if she calculated with variables I cannot identify from doctrine.
Are the humans
She was not
dangerous?
performing altruism for social credit. She was not executing a strategy.
Soldiers, the hour of
She was not,
reckoning is
I have
upon
checked
us.
and rechecked
Stand
this,
firm,
doing
for
anything
victory
that
will
served
be
her
ours.
immediate operational interest. She was hungry. She had been hungry for 31 hours. The food was 3 feet from her. She stepped away from it. I keep trying to find the mechanism,
Dictated every night.
the reward
in a voice
structure,
slightly
the
too
evolutionary
quiet for my
logic,
bunkmate
the
Osip to
social
hear.
bonding coefficient. Something I can put in a cell in my matrix. I cannot find it.
Battle
I am beginning to think, and I will note here for the record that this is a working hypothesis, not a conclusion,
front of the
and
food
I reserve the right to
distribution line
revise
after
it dramatically, that it is not a mechanism. I am beginning to think it is just I
Point to the
stopped.
cluster of small ones.
The heating
The
element
orphans young from
cycled.
The Veth civilian convoy.
I looked at what I'd written. Finished the sentence, what she is. I went to find Doss that afternoon. Not for official reasons.
The readings are spiking
Or not
beyond
only for
parameters.
official
We must act
reasons.
now before it's too late.
I told myself it was a follow-up behavioral assessment, which was a lie I told myself with the specific efficiency of someone who has practiced lying to themselves but not much practice believing it. She was at the perimeter. Not on a signed watch I checked, she wasn't due for another 4 hours. She was just there, sitting on an equipment crate with her back to a blast
neither
barrier,
of us
doing
had a
something
word
with
for
her
what
hands
we
that
had
turned
just
out,
seen.
when I got close enough to see, to be fixing the packaging tape on her left boot. The logistics supply crate had apparently yielded
We
more
had a
material
word
and
for
she was applying
strategy.
it with a concentration that made the job look like surgery. I stood there for a moment before she noticed me. I was holding my coffee. I had
For
gotten
the
a new cup.
calculated kindness that buys
It was still
loyalty.
terrible. I didn't know why I kept drinking it. She looked up. "Sub-Commander," she said. The way she said it wasn't
When no
disrespectful,
one important was
exactly.
watching.
It was the way you say someone's title when you know the title is a little bit funny in the current context and you're both going to pretend it isn't. Sergeant. I crouched down to something
opened my
approximating
log
her eye level, which was a thing I'd made a conscious effort to do since day 3 when I'd noticed that humans seemed to
I
conduct better
deleted
conversations
the
when they
entire
weren't being looked down at.
assessment I had written.
The research on this was actually
This is
quite
what I
robust.
recorded.
May I ask you something? She went back to the boot tape.
Sector details
Sure.
confirm stability.
This morning,
Anomaly Sector 70 shades.
in the distribution tent,
Field
she
assessment
didn't
log,
react.
Provisional attachment.
the tape
Joint
application
humanitarian
continued
corridor.
with the same concentration. You stepped out of the food line. Did I? For the children. Yeah. She tore the tape with her teeth and pressed the edge down flat. Seemed like the thing to do. Seemed like the thing to do. I turned this phrase over for a moment. It was the least satisfying answer I could have received and, simultaneously, the most illuminating. It didn't explain anything. It did not reference strategy or altruism or social obligation or evolutionary programming.
Sergeant First Class
It
Mary
referenced
Doss walked
nothing.
into the distribution.
A baseline. A default. Seemed like the thing to do. As though the alternative had not occurred to her.
The act of holding the cup
As though
gave
stepping
my
past
hand
hungry
something to
children
do
to
while
eat,
I
when you were a person with the choice not to, was a
observed
thing that required
with my
explanation
hand
rather than the other way
fidgeted
around.
at the edge of my uniform.
You were hungry, I said.
I'd rubbed a raw patch
She
into
looked
the
at me.
skin beneath.
Not defensively, she wasn't reading the observation as
Which
criticism.
Osik had pointed out twice,
She seemed
which
genuinely
I
puzzled by
deeply
why I'd
resented
mentioned
him
it.
for noticing.
Sure. You had been for 31 hours. 32 by that point, I think. Maybe 33. She flexed her foot, testing the tape. Boots still going to fall apart. I'm just slowing the process. She looked at me. Why are you
Boot taped
asking?
at the toe with what appeared
I
to be
thought about how to
packaging
answer
material
this.
repurposed from a medical.
I have a training in behavioral sciences that is generally considered rigorous. I have field experience in 6 prior observation postings. I have a methodology. None of my methodology produced a good answer to why are you asking. I am trying, I said finally, to understand something. She
I still
waited.
wasn't accustomed to it.
In VEF
Was
doctrine,
pulled back
I
in
said, the food
configuration
line
that
priority
defied my
exists because
understanding.
operational effectiveness. I know why the food
You
line
can't
is how it is,
escape this.
she said.
Look at what
Not
you've become.
impatiently. Like someone who's been briefed. I'm not arguing with the food line. Then, why? Because the kids had been waiting since before the food line even got set up. She said it the way you say things you've already worked through
Subject
completely,
exhibits
where the conclusion
micro-conceiving
preceded the
behavior
conversation by
motives.
several hours. 40 minutes, maybe more. They didn't have context for why. They were just waiting. And I'd already eaten yesterday, even if it was a long time ago.
Got your 6.
And I was going to
The
eat in 10
distribution
minutes.
tent had been set up by the
She
VEF
looked at her
Compact
boot.
logistics team.
10 minutes didn't seem like much to ask.
Meant it followed compact
10 minutes.
protocol.
She had framed it as 10 minutes. I had framed it as 32 hours of fasting and a concealed physiological tremor.
Always promised.
We had been measuring from different starting points. She stood up. Tested the boot on the ground. Grimaced faintly, which I interpreted as this will hold for now and I will deal with later. Is that all you needed, Sub-Commander? I should have said yes. I had my
Civilians and
observation.
non-combatants to the rear.
I had my new
prioritized
page
by
started.
relative utility to ongoing
I had
operations.
enough. One more thing, I said. She waited again. She was good at waiting. Not passive, the stillness wasn't absence, it was containment. Like something that had learned to
The
be still
appropriate
through
channels
practice
had
rather
thanked
than
me for my
temperament.
input and then done
The boy, I
absolutely
said.
nothing.
Taith. He was watching you. Something moved in her face that I couldn't fully read.
So the
Not
orphans
emotion exactly,
were at
or
the
not
back.
just emotion. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who knew they'd been watched and had made peace with it. Kids watch everything, she said. That's kind of
Before
the whole
joint
point.
unit even arrived in
She walked back toward the perimeter. I stood there next to the blast barrier with my terrible coffee and my new assessment page and the slowly forming understanding that the most important data I'd collected in 11 days had happened in 4 seconds in a food tent, and the subject of the data didn't think it was data. She thought it was just Tuesday. Field assessment log, day 11. Personal notation continues. I have a new hypothesis.
They sat in a
It is
cluster
not
near the
finished.
rear tent pole.
I will keep adding to it. Working title, The Mathematics of 10 Minutes.
We need to check it.
I do not yet know where this is going.
Stay sharp.
I suspect it is going somewhere I did not expect when I took this posting.
Post with a quality
I am drinking another cup of field coffee. I don't know why I keep doing that either. Field assessment log, provisional attachment, joint humanitarian
No, this
corridor,
can't be
sector
happening.
9 Mireth logged by,
Get
Sub-Commander
my ass!
Velathorin, 3rd Behavioral Sciences,
the way the
Beth
very
Compact
young
Day
and the
14
very
of
old and the
observation
very
sequence.
powerless wait, not
Personal
with
notation
patience.
flag, active. The rain had been going for 6 hours. I want to be precise about this because the rain in Sector 9 Mireth is a specific kind of miserable that I feel deserves documentation. It is not rain in the meteorological sense I grew up with, the clean, brief, vertical affairs of the VEF interior. Mireth rain comes sideways.
Current service.
It comes with a smell like scorched wet clay. It soaks through the standard issue compact weather covering in approximately 40 minutes and, then, spends the remaining hours of its
On my
event
mark,
being smug
advance
about
to
it.
the ridge. Copy that.
I was
Go.
in the secondary command post,
Formation, eyes
which was a
open.
generous name for a tent with 3 overlapping tarps and a heating element that made the cycling sound twice as loud in enclosed spaces.
She said something to
My
the
coffee
soldier
had
ahead
gone
of her that
cold.
made him snort laugh.
Again. I kept forgetting to drink it before it went cold. Osek had pointed this out with a brevity that implied several longer conversations he'd decided not to have. I was writing. Not the official assessment that had been submitted on day 12, in its revised form, and had been received by the appropriate channels with the specific silence that meant either they were considering it carefully or they had flagged it for review and, then, buried it in a queue. The appropriate channels were not yet in my official filing system. They were in a private notation I was calling entities I have complicated feelings about. I was writing about Taith. He had started appearing near my observation post on day 5.
I can't get out.
I had noted it, evaluated it for threat or theft potential, settled on neither, and logged him under civilian adjacent, adolescent, behavior,
Pressed her hands
observational
flat,
hovering.
She thought no one was watching.
On day 6 he had sat down approximately 4 meters from my position without asking and watched the perimeter with an expression of focused boredom that I'd found oddly companionable. On day 7 he had moved to 2 meters. On day 8 he had said, in the flat regional Veth dialect of the Mireth corridor, "You write a lot." I had said, yes. He had
11
considered
days
this.
embedded in a field operation.
What do you write?
It is designed to be efficient.
What I see.
Not fair.
Another consideration.
There it stands, the fortress
He
of
had
our
the quality of someone who processed
Path is
things
clear.
completely before
Let's go.
speaking, which in a 14-year-old
this in
felt
the
like
abstract.
watching something expensive and unusual. Can I see? No,
I had apparently
Why
not
not?
understood it in the specific.
because it's an official assessment. What are you assessing?
Prioritizing combat
I had
personnel
looked at him.
ensures operational readiness.
He looked back. Not defiant, there was no challenge in it. Just the completely direct inquiry of someone who had decided that the traditional conversational hedging rituals were a poor use of his current time. I had said, the humans. He had looked toward the human section of the camp, which was visible from our position, a cluster of prefab shelters with some kind of hand-drawn marking on the entrance that I'd been meaning to catalog and hadn't gotten to. Why? Because we don't fully understand them yet. He was quiet for a while.
DOS had
The
reached
perimeter
front of the
sounds did what they did. The artillery or thunder made its ambiguous contribution. I think I understand them, he said. I had noted this in my log and
Ran the
not pursued it,
distribution point
because day 8
with
was
the
before the
focus
food line
marked
incident,
up.
and
Someone
at that
who
point I had a
believed
different set of
deeply in his
active questions.
All right, team, move
Now
out.
it was
Yes,
day
sir.
14,
Sensors
and
clear,
I found myself going back to what he'd said, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living under it. I think I understand them. The incident had been 3 days ago. Not the food line, a different incident.
in the shadows.
One that had started as a supply problem and become, in the way that things in Sector 9 Mireth had a talent for becoming, something else
She
entirely.
was looking at the cluster of
I will
children
back
near
up.
the tent pole.
The corridor road, the one that connected our camp to the secondary
Teth
humanitarian
put his arms
post
around the
12
small
kilometers west, had been compromised by a rockfall on day 12.
The middle-sized
This was
one
assessed
sitting in
as
a row
weather
of
event,
varying
not
stages
tactical. The rockfall had taken out approximately 40 meters of road surface and deposited it in the drainage channel below with the completeness of something that had been planning this for a while and had finally committed. The implications: supply convoy blocked. For vehicles, 2 of them carrying the medical resupply that the secondary post had been flagged as critically needing for 2 days. One of those vehicles carrying, I checked the manifest 3 times because I kept not believing it, the food allocation for the orphan group, who had been separated from the primary camp during a brief relocate and consolidate on day 11 and were now at the secondary post. 11 children. Separated from the primary camp. Food allocation sitting on the wrong side of a 40-meter
Not
rockfall.
hedging out.
Compact protocol for a blocked corridor road. Submit blockage report, request engineering assessment, await engineering team. Estimated response time, 2 to 4 days. 2 to 4 days.
And lines respond.
I had submitted the blockage report. I had flagged it urgent.
This coffee
The
smells
appropriate
amazing.
channels had
Let's see
thanked
if
me
it's
for
still
my
hot.
flag. DOS had found out about the blockage on day 12 at approximately 1,400 hours. I know this because I was sitting 12 feet from her when Corporal Yash showed her the logistics notification on his handheld. I watched her face process the information. She had a specific face for receiving information she didn't like. It wasn't anger. I'd learned to read her anger by now, and anger had a different quality, a kind of clarifying sharpness.
Not be caged.
This was something slower. Something that went through the information like fingers through water, checking the temperature of it, assessing the current. She asked Yas 3 questions. I noted them. How long has the secondary post been waiting on the medical resupply?
Move forward, quietly.
What's the road actually like? Is it a full barrier or is there passage on foot? Which vehicles are which? Then, she walked away from Yas and went to look at the road herself, despite the fact that the road was 600 meters from camp and it was raining. Osek said, next to me, she's going to do something.
Kids while I wait.
You don't know that, I said. She has the face.
Different.
What face?
There was a pause.
The
where I
face
could hear
humans
the
make
little
before they do
coffee
something
element cycling
inadvisable.
in. The corner
Osek
and a
paused.
distant sound.
You've
It
been
might have
studying them for
artillery, it
2
might have
weeks.
been thunder.
You know the face.
Because in Sector 9
I
Mirror,
did know the
everything
face.
sounded like everything else.
What she did, in the end, was not inadvisable. I want to be clear about this because I have already filed one assessment that raised concerns about my objectivity and I would
looked
prefer
at his
not to
manifest.
compound the record. What she did was technically within mission parameters. She found 3 other humans, Yas, a woman named Specialist Farron I hadn't fully catalogued yet, and
looked
a
back
combat
at the
engineer named
expression
Drill who
that
I'd
would
noted
not
only
have been
because of
able
the way he
to
walked,
on
like
day
someone who
one,
had
but-
developed a deep personal grievance against flat ground, and proposed what she called a manual relay. The rockfall was impassable by vehicle. It was not impassable by a person who was willing to climb. We carry it over,
Pause
she
is
told
not
them.
going to work on me.
I was observing from a distance, in the rain, under the weather covering I'd given up resenting because resentment wasn't keeping me drier. 4 of us, 2 trips each, we can move what the secondary post actually needs before dark. Drill said, that's about 60 kilograms each, over a rockfall, in this weather. Yes. He looked at the rockfall.
What happened next?
He looked at the rain.
And I want to be precise.
He looked
about
at
this.
DOS. Okay, he said.
I want to get the sequence
That was
right,
it.
because the sequence
That was the
matters.
full
It's not a
deliberation.
scene.
Okay.
It was not
I
a
noted,
moment.
human drill. Decision-making process, negligible deliberation time, high apparent threshold for physical cost, deferral to DOS's assessment without documented reasoning.
Field
Pattern
conditions,
consistent
joint
with prior human
humanitarian
consensus
corridors.
observation. DOS functions as informal authority structure
It was
independent of
just a
official
series
rank.
of small things.
What I
happening
meant
in a
was,
row.
they trusted her. Not because she outranked them,
Death stood
Drill
up
was
in the
actually
pirate
1
approach.
grade above her on the joint force chart. Because she had stepped out of a food line 3 days
14,
ago and none of
by
them had
then
forgotten it,
developmental
even if
standards,
none of them were mentioning it.
early adolescent range.
The carry took
which
3
meant he had the
hours.
characteristic combination
I followed
not
them.
Quite adult wariness.
Osek had told
and
me
not
this was
quite
outside my
child.
observation brief,
That is
which
the
was
most
technically true,
exhausting thing
and
to
I had
observe,
told him I was
because you
broadening my
feel
brief,
both of them.
which was technically my right as observational lead,
Perimeter
and
clear,
he had
advance.
done the thing where he produced a silence
Blowing
that
fields
contained a
ahead,
full
eyes open.
argument without deploying a single word of it.
He straightened up.
I followed them anyway. The rockfall was bad. Not insurmountable, the humans had been right about that, there was passage, but bad. Loose material, wet, with a gradient that kept shifting. The kind of terrain that makes you reconsider decisions at each individual footfall. DOS went first. Every time. Not because she
Looked at the
announced
front
she
of
was
the
going
line,
first, she
where
just
DOS
went,
had
and
stepped
the others
aside.
followed, and this appeared to be a pattern so established that it required no discussion. I watched her pick the line, test each hold, shift a load of 40 kilograms plus standard kit across a rockfall in wet boots with tape on the left toe and whatever the strip of signal scarf counted as on the right sleeve. She fell once. On the second trip, the 3rd quarter of the climb, her left hand missed a hold and she went sideways. She caught herself on a knee and an elbow and spent 4 seconds repositioning without putting down the load. The elbow bled. I could see it from where I stood,
And
a
the
dark
soldier
stain
was
spreading
laughing
through
at
the
that
remaining
pressure valve
fabric.
sound.
She repositioned. Tested the hold. Kept going. Nobody said anything. Not a word. They watched her catch herself, watched her continue, and then continued themselves,
the
with the
whole
specific
thing right
collective
there in
respect
2
of people
words.
who understand that acknowledging
know
an
what to
injury mid-climb is more dangerous than the injury. 3 hours. For trips shared between them. 62 kilograms of supplies delivered to the secondary post via human back end, wet rock end, bloody elbow and the apparently bottomless well of drill saying okay when asked to do things. I got to the secondary post ahead of them on the return trip, because I had taken the long way around on the road with the compact runner vehicle and my terrible coffee and my conscience, which had spent the 3-hour carry making unhelpful observations about what I was and wasn't doing. The children were there. 11 of them. The secondary post was smaller than the primary camp, tighter, with the slightly pressurized quality of a space that's holding more people than it was designed for. Taith had them in a cluster again. He always had them in a cluster. It was his default configuration, as though he'd appointed himself a gravitational body and they were the bodies in orbit. When the supplies came through the door, carried by 4 muddy, rain-soaked, one of them bleeding humans, Taith stood up. He looked at the supplies. He looked at Doss. She was setting down her load with the focused attention of someone whose arms had been at load capacity for several hours. She was looking at the supplies, at the medic who'd come forward to assess the contents, at Yas who was already opening containers and starting inventory.
When she finally got to the
She was not looking at Taith. He kept looking at her.
She ate with the
I
focused
noted,
mechanical
Taith.
quality of someone refueling
Observational
machine.
focus on Doss.
Efficient.
Duration,
Romantic.
47
Standing
seconds.
up because the bench near
Expression,
her was occupied,
working
and she
hypothesis
didn't
in
bother to
progress.
find.
Then, Taith did something I had not expected. He walked to the food container, which was not yet open, the medic had priority, and stood beside it. Waited. When Farron came to open it, Taith pointed to the 2 smallest ones, Voss and Mira, who were at the back of the cluster. He said, in his flat Mereth dialect, they eat first. Farron looked at him. Looked at the children.
Weapons hot.
Looked at Doss, who still wasn't watching.
Push forward.
Of course, Farron said, and opened the container, and began. I had my stylus on my log sheet and I could not move it for approximately 90 seconds.
Copy that lead. Moving.
This is not a long time. 90 seconds.
A leader and a coward.
In 90 seconds, very little happens in any physically significant sense.
Not in the
In 90 seconds, I fully reconsidered 3 years of academic work. Taith had been watching for 6
Threat
days.
analysis complete. Deploy.
He had been 4 meters from my observation post and watching the humans and watching Doss and filing it all away in that expensive, unusual processing system he had, the one that worked slowly and
Filing our
completely.
little reports with our little
He had watched a woman he'd never spoken to step out of a food line for children she didn't know, and he had not heard an explanation for it, and he had not received a speech about it, and he had not been given a lesson.
Are the humans dangerous?
He had just watched. And 3 days later, in a different post, with a different person
Soldiers,
opening a
the
different
hour of reckoning
container,
is upon
with the
us.
2 smallest ones at the
Stand
back
firm,
of a
victory
cluster,
will be
he had
ours.
repeated her. Not because he was performing it. Not because Doss was watching, she wasn't. Not because anyone had told him this was the correct thing. Because he had watched, and processed, and arrived at his own
Every night.
mathematics.
In a voice slightly
Someone
too
is
quiet
worse
for
off than me.
Nosek to hear.
Therefore, I found him later, after the supplies were distributed and the medic had done something to Doss's elbow that she'd submitted to with the resigned patience of someone who knows they're losing this particular argument, and most of the secondary post had settled into the compressed restlessness of an evening that was better than yesterday. He was in the corner
Point
he'd
to the
claimed,
cluster of
back to
small
the wall,
ones.
arms
The
around the
orphan
2
young to the
smallest
deaf
ones who had
civilian
gone to
convoy.
sleep with the indifference to bedtime of children who were very young and very tired. I sat down near him. Not close.
No, this can't
4
be right.
meters.
The readings are spiking
The
beyond
distance he'd
parameters.
chosen at
We
the
must act
beginning.
now before it's too late.
He looked at me.
Let them eat first.
He didn't say anything. You heard me earlier, I said.
I looked at Oscar.
When I told Doss I was trying to understand something. He thought about it. The food line thing. Yes. Did you figure it out? I considered
Neither of us
this.
said a word.
My coffee was
Because
in my
neither of
hand,
us had a
cold,
word for
terrible,
what we had
pressed
just
against
seen.
my mouth in its habitual barrier function. I'm working on it, I said. He was quiet. The
We
sleeping
had a
weight of
word
Voss
for
and Mira
strategy.
shifted, and he adjusted without looking down, automatic, the correction already built into his muscle memory. What she did, he said. Not a question.
For the calculated
Not a
kindness
judgment.
that buys loyalty.
Just the phrase, set down between us. Yes. I'd been thinking about it, he said. Since the first time. I did not
When
say
no one
anything.
important was watching.
I'd learned, over 14 days, that the best responses to Tate's thinking out loud were no responses at all. In the convoy, he said, before the pass, my mother did something like that.
I opened
There
my
were
log
people
back
who'd
up.
been walking longer than us. She made me give them our water. I sat
deleted
very still.
The entire assessment
She said, he
I had
stopped.
written.
Started again.
This is what I recorded.
She said the point of having enough is that you can give some away. The heating element in the corner cycled.
Firm stability.
Mira made a
Anomalous
small
effects
sleep
at
sound.
scan. Results incoming.
Outside, the rain was doing what the rain in Mireth
Provisional
always did,
attachment.
which was
Joint
continue.
Humanitarian corridor.
I didn't understand it then, Taith said. I was angry about the water. We were walking too. We were thirsty too. A pause. And then, the pass happened, and it didn't matter anymore, the water thing. But, I kept thinking about it. I should not have asked the next question. It was outside my assessment brief. It was personal, not scientific, and it was almost certainly going to produce information that I would have to figure out what to do with.
Had labeled
I asked
field
it
coffee
anyway.
when Sergeant First Class
And
Marin
now,
Voss walked into the
He
distribution.
looked at the sleeping boss. At Myra's face, slackened, unbothered with the democracy of sleep that small children have.
I drank it anyway.
Now I think
because
she was
the act
right,
of holding
he
the
said.
Cup gave my hands
I think the
something to
point
do
is that
while
when
I
you have something you can give away, you're not really the only one holding
If
it.
my hands were not occupied.
The heating
they would fidget
element
with the edge of
cycled.
My uniform collar.
I wrote nothing
till
for
I
a
rubbed
moment.
A raw patch into the skin
Then,
beneath.
I wrote, not the only one holding it. Then, I stopped,
Which also
because I
he
needed to
pointed
think
out
about
twice,
that,
and
and
which I
thinking about it while
deeply
trying to write
resented
about it
him
was
for
a recipe
noticing.
for writing something either very profound or very embarrassing, and I didn't yet know which. Doss appeared in the doorway of the secondary post at 2100 hours, assessed the interior with the vigilance idle scan, and sat down with her back to the wall on the opposite side from where Taith and I were positioned. Her elbow had a compact issue field dressing on it that was already showing through staining at the edge.
Material repurposed
The
from
medic had apparently not one as cleanly as she'd implied. She had a ration pack. She was eating with the same mechanical efficiency I'd noted at the primary camp, standing position eating replaced by wall position eating, but the quality identical, refueling, not dining. She looked up, found me, registered that I was sitting near Taith, and
I
something
still
moved
wasn't
briefly in her
accustomed to it.
face.
was pulled back.
Not
in a
surprise.
configuration that defied my
Not
understanding.
concern. Something
You
quieter.
can't escape this.
Something like a
Look at
person
what
who
you've
has done a
become.
thing and is noticing, from a distance, that the thing has continued. She went back to her food. I wrote, subject
Trembling
DOS.
beneath the pressure of being
2100 hours. Observing Taith.
subject
Duration,
exhibits
4
microconcealment
seconds.
Behavior upper limb
Expression,
distress.
see earlier notation not performing. Then, I crossed out the note. Not because it was wrong. Because it felt
Commanding, This
reductive.
is Alpha. Target in
What
sight,
was on her
requesting
face
backup.
was not an
Copy,
absence
Alpha.
of performance.
Moving up.
It was the specific
distribution
expression of
tent
someone
had
who
been
had
set up
planted
by the
something
Vet
without being
Compact
sure it would grow,
Logistics team.
and was now watching it grow, and was being careful not to look too long in case looking too long was a form of tending that could damage the thing. I didn't have a Veth word for that either.
Algorithmic elegance
I was
Compact
beginning to
protocol
compile a
always
list.
Promised.
OSSEC messaged me at 2140 via the field communicator. The message read, "Where are you?" I typed back, secondary post. Observation. He responded after a pause with, "The observation brief does not include the secondary post." I responded,
Civilians
I
and
broadened it.
non-combatants to the rear.
He responded with
prioritized by
silence,
relative
which for
utility to
OSSEC had
ongoing
become a
operations.
language of considerable sophistication. I put the communicator away and looked at the room. Doss was finished eating. She had folded the ration packaging with the habitual precision I documented, put it in her
The
thigh
appropriate
pocket, and
channels have
was now
thanked me
doing the
for my
idle
input
but
and
watching
then
thing
done
against her wall.
Absolutely nothing.
Taith was asleep, which had happened at some point in the last 20 minutes without my noticing, tipped slightly sideways, the two small ones still anchored
So the
against him.
orphans were at the
The
back.
secondary post had the specific nighttime quality of spaces that are holding more need than they were built for, a compressed, slightly pressurized quiet, where everyone was either asleep or performing quiet for the sake of those who were.
Before the joint
I
unit
thought
would
about what
arrive
Taith
in
had said. Not the only one holding it. I thought about Doss and the food line. About the mathematics she was apparently running, the one where 32 hours of hunger became 10 minutes by measuring from the right
That's our
starting
entry
point.
Let's go. Copy that.
The one where having enough, even the marginal, fractional enough of a field ration, meant you were not the only one holding it. I thought about the rockfall. About Drill saying okay. About Farron opening the
sat in
food
the
container
cluster
and
near the
not
rear.
questioning why the children should go first, just accepting it as Taith had placed it, the same way Pyarth had accepted it as DOS had placed it.
Roger. Moving.
I thought about transmission.
There.
In behavioral science, we have models for how behaviors propagate through populations. Social learning, cultural transmission, norm adoption. We have very good models.
No, this
Very
can't be
clean
happening.
models.
Get
The
my
models
ass!
describe the mechanism observation, repetition,
very young
reinforcement,
and the very
and
old
they
and the
describe
very
the timescale
powerless
and
wait,
the fidelity
not
of
with
transmission.
patience.
The models did not, as far as I could find, address the question of quality. Not whether the behavior transmitted,
Suspend
but
animation.
what happened to it in
Stop
transmission.
expecting things to happen
Whether the
anyway.
person who received it understood it from the
I
inside,
noted
or was just
Orphan
running the
wrote.
external pattern. Taith had not run the external pattern.
Estimate
When he'd
wait
pointed to
30
Voss and
minutes,
Mira and
current
said they
service
eat
rate.
first, he had not been mimicking DOS. He had been acting from a mathematics he had arrived at independently, seated by his mother in the convoy, grown in the 6 days
On my
he'd spent
mark,
watching the
advance to
humans,
ridge.
integrated
Copy that.
into
Go.
something that was now genuinely
Formation,
his.
Eyes open.
He had received something and made it his own. That was not transmission. That was something
She
else.
said something to the soldier
I was
ahead of
going
her
to
that
need a
made
new
him
page
snort
for this
laugh.
too. I stayed at the secondary post until midnight. At midnight, DOS did something that I was still thinking about when I finally got in the runner vehicle and drove the 12 kilometers back to the primary camp in the sideways Mireth rain. She got up. She walked to the corner where Taith was asleep with the small ones. She stopped about 2 feet from him and stood there for a moment with her head slightly tilted, the way you look at something when you're assessing it and trying not to be
Wears
intrusive
5
about the
expressions
assessing.
over each other like Stratton.
Then, she took off her outer layer, the jacket, the one that had the missing right sleeve and the signal scarf replacement, and draped it over the 3 of them. Tucked the edge in along Taith's back.
What is this place?
Not waking him,
I can't.
she walked back to her wall. Sat down. Put her back to the wall and started the idle but watching scan from the opposite side of the
Hands
room.
flat again when she thought no
Without
one
a
was watching.
jacket. In a secondary post in Sector 9 Mareth, in the middle of a 6-hour sideways rain, at midnight. The field dressing on her elbow showed through staining a little more. I noted, DOS. Jacket. 0001 hours. Then, I wrote, under it, she still hasn't figured out I'm watching.
11 days embedded
Or
in a
she's
field
figured it out
operation.
and decided
is
it doesn't
designed to be
change
efficient,
anything.
Not fair.
I am genuinely unsure which interpretation is more unsettling. On the drive back, with the Mireth rain doing what it did and the heating elements cycling in the runner vehicle with its familiar sound, I thought about the assessment I was building.
I had apparently
The official
not
version,
understood
the
it
one
in
for the
specific.
appropriate channels, the one with the grid and the cross-references
The
and
abstract
the behavioral
prioritizing
category
combat
headers,
personnel
was coming
ensures
along.
operational readiness.
It said careful, documented things about human social bonding behaviors, informal authority structures, and the interesting divergence between stated compact doctrine and effective field results. The appropriate channels would receive it with their characteristic silence. The private version, the one I was dictating into my personal log at a volume OSEC couldn't hear, was saying something different. It was trying to say, a 14-year-old boy lost his family in the Mireth Pass and found himself responsible for 10 other children he had no obligation to, and he is handling it the way his mother
Cross
handled it,
reached
the
the
way
front
the
of the
human
line.
soldier handles it, the way anyone handles it who has received the mathematics and understood it from the inside. The mathematics is, you are not the only one holding it.
Who
The
ran
mathematics is,
distribution
the point of having
with the
enough is that
focused
you can give
martyrdom
some away.
of someone who believed
The mathematics is, they eat first.
All right, team, move out.
I do not know what to do with this
Stay
mathematics.
sharp. Eyes on the horizon.
It is not in my training. I am fairly certain it is not in the appropriate channels. I suspect it is in something much older than either.
The path
I am going to keep documenting it.
movement in the shadows.
I am going to keep drinking this terrible coffee. I am going to go back to the secondary post tomorrow.
until
Field
she was
assessment
looking at a
log,
cluster
day
of children
14.
near the tent pole.
Personal notation ends. The rain is still
Teth
going.
with his arms around the small
The elbow is probably fine. Humans are difficult to damage
the middle-sized
permanently.
ones sitting in a row of
I have
varying
documented
stages of-
this extensively. Taith is sleeping under Doss's jacket.
I do not know why I
I find I want this to mean something in a way I can eventually put into words. I will try again tomorrow.
Didn't move.
Field assessment log, provisional attachment, joint humanitarian corridor, Sector 9 Mireth logged by Sub-Commander Velithorin, 3rd Behavioral Sciences, Beth Compact Day 19 of observation sequence. Final entry. Personal notation flag, active. Notation, I am aware this has become primarily personal notation. I am leaving it flagged as active anyway. The extraction order came on day 18. Not for the unit, for me. My provisional attachment had been extended twice already, first on my own request, then, on a second request that Osek had co-signed with the expression of someone who had decided the most efficient path was capitulation. The second extension expired at 0800 on day 18 and, the appropriate channels sent me a very polite communication that thanked me for my service to the joint assessment mission and, notified me that my transport would arrive at 1400 for departure to Beth Compact Central Command. I was to deliver my findings in person. I read the notification 3 times. Then, I put my coffee down. It was cold, it was always cold. I had apparently never in 19 days managed to drink a cup of this terrible substance while it was still warm and went to find Doss. She was at the vehicle bay. She was always at the vehicle bay in the mornings, which I had figured out on day 9 was because the vehicle bay had the best angle on the approach road and the worst angle on the camp interior, which meant you could watch for incoming and not watch the camp watch you back. She was sitting on the hood of a transport carrier with a tool in her hand and the carrier's access panel open and the focused expression of someone who is either repairing something or has found a task that lets them think without appearing to think.
Copy that. Eyes on the
I
flank.
stood at the edge of the vehicle bay. She noticed me immediately. She always noticed immediately. It was a quality of hers that I had catalogued 17 times under environmental awareness, elevated, consistent with extended threat exposure periods, but which I had privately started thinking of simply as she notices things, and she didn't move, just acknowledged me with a half tilt of the head that meant yes, I see you, I'm not leaving.
There was a pause.
I
where
walked
could hear
over.
the field coffee heating
I
element
stood next to the
cycling in.
carrier for a moment.
Corner and a distant
I'm
sound
leaving today,
that might
I
have been
said.
artillery and might have been
Transport
thunder.
at 1400.
Because in
She
Sector
looked
9
at me.
Mirith, everything sounded
Then,
like everything
at the
else.
access panel. Then, back at me. Okay. I wanted to tell you. Something on her face, that layered quality,
looked
the
at it
strata,
manifest.
doing what they did. That's decent of you, she said, and meant it plainly, without irony, which was such a clean response that it caught me off guard. I have been observing you, I said.
She looked back at him with an
For
expression
19
that I
days.
would not have been able to
I want you to
decode
know that I'm aware
from
this is.
the
I stopped.
Target
I had
locked.
prepared this
Fire on
sentence
mark.
and it
Copy.
wasn't
Weapon
working.
charged and ready.
I'm aware it's a strange thing to be the subject of. I knew you were watching, she said. Day 2. Day 2.
Pause is not going to
I had
work
thought
on
I'd
me.
been subtle on day 2. And, you didn't what? Mind? She tilted the tool in her hand, examining something in the access panel with a single eye like she was looking through a scope. I figured if you were going to watch, you were going to watch. Not a lot I can do about it. You could have changed your behavior.
What happened next?
She looked at me.
And I want to be precise
Flat.
about this.
Why would I do that? I did
wanna
not
get
have
the
an
sequence
answer.
Right, because the sequence
She went
matters,
back to the access
not a
panel.
scene.
This, I thought, was the whole answer to the question I'd been trying to frame for 19 days. Why would I do that? I had submitted my official assessment on day 17. 12 pages, annotated, with a summary that I'd written and
Joint
rewritten 6
humanitarian
times
corridor.
before arriving at language I thought the appropriate channels might actually sit with
It
rather
was
than
just a
file and
series of
forget.
small things happening in
The
a
summary
row.
said, among other things, human personnel in joint force contexts
stood up
present a
from the pilot's
behavioral
approach.
profile that is consistent across observed stress conditions, resource scarcity, and
He was 14,
interpersonal conflict,
which
with
by
the notable
Beth's
characteristic that
developmental
group-oriented
standards
resource
were in the
allocation
early
decisions
adolescent
appear to
range,
originate
which
at the
meant he had
individual
characteristic
level rather than
combination
through
of not
hierarchical
quite the
mandate.
wariness and
In
not
practical
quite child.
terms, humans
Hope
give
that
things
is the
away.
most exhausting thing
They
to
do this
observe
not as
because
strategic
you feel
investment in
both of
social
them
capital, though it
fighting
produces that effect.
Perimeter clear, advancing.
They do this as a base state behavior,
fields ahead,
particularly under conditions of scarcity, which contradicts
straightened
the
up
standard
because you
compact
took
model in which scarcity increases competitive resource retention. The mechanism is not yet understood. The effect is. The appropriate channels had, as of my departure morning, acknowledged receipt of the assessment and informed me that it would be reviewed in due course, which was a phrase I had added to my private notation under entities I have complicated feelings about. The private
Looked at the front of
notation
the
was
line
much longer
where
than the
Dawson
official
stepped
assessment.
aside
At 0940, Taith found me.
and found her immediately.
I was at my observation post
way
empty of
displaced
useful
people
observation
find the person
material,
who moved
given
for
that I was leaving in 4
With
hours,
specific
but
optical
I'd come back
accuracy,
to it
someone
anyway
checked
because
it
it felt
confirmed
like the
this is
place I
real.
should be if I was going to have
wasn't
one
looking.
last attempt at writing something true about what I'd seen here. He sat down. 4 meters. His original distance. He was wearing Doss's jacket. She had not asked for it back.
The tremor briefly
I had
forgotten.
not seen her ask for it back. It appeared to have simply become his, by the quiet transfer of property that happens when someone gives a thing away without naming the giving. I noted, Taith. Jacket. Day 19. You're leaving, he said. Yes. She told me. He pulled the jacket
That
tighter.
was the whole thing.
It
right
was too
there.
large
Two
for him,
words,
considerably too large,
didn't know
built
what
for
to do with
Doss's
it.
frame, so the sleeves folded back at his wrists. She said you were going to write a report. I already did. What does it say?
Didn't open it.
I thought about the 12 official pages. I thought about the 80-something private notation pages. I thought about all the grids I'd deleted and the new
Somewhere in the
pages
middle
I'd
of this,
started
he
and
was
the ones that were still
distributing with a
unfinished
focused
because I hadn't yet
efficiency I
found the
hadn't
right
seen
framing.
from-
It says the humans are more complicated than the models predicted, I said. He considered this. That's it? That's the version they'll read. He looked at me for a moment with the working hypothesis expression. What's the version you'd actually say? I looked at my cold coffee,
I was not drinking.
pressed it against my mouth in the barrier way. Took it away.
I was using it as a
I would say
physical
I
barrier
started
between
and
my
then
face
stopped
and the room
because I'd written
I
20
did
drafts
not
of this
know
in my
what
personal
my-
log and none of them had been
Nothing
right.
beats a hot cup of coffee out here.
You
in the
can
wild.
just say it, he said.
Cheers to the simple things.
I won't tell anyone.
Osik was next.
That's not, I stopped again. The difficulty is not confidentiality. The difficulty is that I don't have the right word. He waited. There is a thing, I said carefully, that I have watched your people do your people, and the humans, and I am beginning to think it is not separate from each other but actually the same thing moving through different people, and I don't have a word for it in Veth.
She ate with the
He was
focused
very still.
mechanical quality of someone
There is a thing where
refueling
someone has
machine.
something enough of something,
Efficient.
just enough, sometimes
Unromantic.
barely enough, and
Standing
they
up
look at the
because
people
bench
around them
nearest
and
her was
they give some of it
occupied, and
away.
She didn't bother to find.
Not because they're calculating a return. Not because someone is watching. Not because doctrine or protocol or hierarchy tells them to. Just because I stopped. Ran through my 17 attempts at this sentence. Because it seems like the thing to do, I said. He was quiet. Your mother said the point of having enough is that you can give some away. I looked at him.
Eyes sharp, weapons hot.
I have been
Move.
thinking about that for 6
Contact
days.
possible ahead. Push forward.
I think she was right. But I think it is also not complete. He tilted his head slightly. The working hypothesis expression changed, became less a question and more a listening. I think the reason that's true, I said, is that you are never, actually, only the one holding it. Whatever you have, food, warmth, a 10-minute wait, a jacket, I glanced at the jacket on his shoulders. You receive it with all the people who might have needed it before you, and you hold it in trust for the people who need it next. The holding is temporary. The giving away is the thing you were doing all along.
Filing
Taith
out
was
little
looking
reports
at the
with our little
ground.
checkboxes.
I said nothing. He said, eventually, very
We
quietly,
must go
she
now.
knows that.
Shadows are near.
I see.
Doss?
We move together.
Both of them.
Stay close.
Lead on.
He looked up.
Are the humans dangerous?
My mother knew it. Doss knows it. He pressed his hands against his thighs for a moment, a gesture I recognized, the flat press, the containment, and then let them relax. I'm learning it. The heating element on my post cycled. The sideways rain had stopped 2 days ago and Nereth was in one of its intervals of sharp, spare light, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been cleaned recently and was
In a voice
waiting.
Slightly too quiet.
You
for
are
my
14,
bunkmate
I
to
said.
hear.
Yeah. That is very early to understand this. I had good teachers, he said.
Battle-worn human soldier.
One of them was
Not
sleeping
eaten in
under the
31
ground in the
hours.
Mireth Pass. The other was currently at the vehicle bay with a tool and an access panel and a flat press on her hands that she deployed whenever she wanted to hide that something
Point to
hurt.
the cluster of small ones.
He didn't say
The
either
orphan
of those
young from the
things.
best civilian convoy.
I wrote them down. At 1100 I found Doss at the vehicle bay again. She had not moved. The access panel had apparently yielded something, because the tool was different, a smaller one, more precise, and there was a faint smell of machine oil that I had catalogued as one of the background constants of the human section of camp.
I looked at Osik.
Can I ask you something? I said. You've been asking me things for 19 days, she said. One more. She set down the smaller tool and looked at me with the
Neither of
waiting
us said a
quality,
word,
the containment, the practiced
Because neither
stillness.
of us had a word for what
Do
we
you
had
know that
just
tape
seen.
is, that he repeats what you do? She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant the question had found something that was already there.
Strategy.
I notice it sometimes, she said. Does it feel like I stopped? Started over. What does it feel like? She looked at
For
the access
calculated
panel.
kindness that buys
Looked at her
loyalty.
hand with the machine oil on the fingers. Looked at some middle distance that I couldn't quite follow. Heavy, she said. Good heavy.
When no
Like
one
she
important was
paused.
Watching.
Searched. You know when you're carrying something, and it's not too much, but you can feel the weight of it? And the weight is a good thing because it means the thing you're carrying
I
is
opened
real?
my log back up.
I wrote, heavy. Good heavy. Real.
I deleted
Yes, I
the
said.
entire assessment
Like that.
I had written.
She picked up the tool
This is
again.
what I recorded.
He's going to be okay. The kid. I know.
Sector
The
details
little
confirm
ones too.
stability.
They've
Anomalous
got
sector
someone looking
certification.
out for them.
Results incoming.
She turned back to the access panel with the focused quality of someone returning to work.
Corridor.
People like that, the ones who figure out the looking out thing while they're still young, they end up being the people who hold things together later. She said this plainly. Like a fact. Like something she had simply observed, the way I observe things, with the same plainness I aspired to and frequently failed at. Das, I said. She looked at me. In 19 days, I have never once seen you look at what you've done and call it anything. She stared at me for a moment with the flat expression that preceded the layered one.
Had labeled field
Because it
coffee
isn't anything,
when Sergeant
she
First
said.
Class Marin Doss
It's
walked
just,
into the
I know.
distribution.
The thing to do. Yeah. I don't have a word for that, I said. In VEF.
Drank it anyway because the
There
act
are
of
words for
holding the cup
sacrifice
gave
and
my hand
strategy
something
and
to do while
altruism and social investment.
Observe.
None of them are the
If
right
my
word.
hands were not occupied, they would
She looked
fidget
at
with
me
the
for
edge
a
of my
long
uniform
moment.
collar.
We don't
till I
really
rubbed
have a
raw
word for it
patch
either,
into the
she
skin
said.
beneath.
In any language I know. She went
Which
back to
also
the
had
access
pointed
panel.
out twice, and which
I
I
stood there for a
deeply
moment
resented
longer
him
than
for
was probably
noticing.
warranted. Then, I walked back to my post to pack my things. At 1,330 minutes before transport, I sat at my empty post and wrote the last entry in my personal log. I had been trying to write it for 3 days. Every time I got close to the thing I was trying to say, it slid sideways into either sentiment or academic formality, and both of those were wrong, and I'd delete the draft and start again. I tried one more time. Personal notation, day 19, 1,330 hours. Leaving in 30 minutes. I want to get this down before I go, because I am worried that in the context of compact central command, in the clean corridors and the grid-lined offices
still
and
wasn't
the
accustomed
appropriate
to it.
channels,
Was
something
pulled
about what
back
I've
in a
learned here will lose
configuration
its
that
texture.
defied my understanding.
I want to keep the texture.
You can't escape
Here
this.
is what I observed. A
Look at
woman
what
stepped
you've
out of a
become.
food line for children she didn't know. She was hungry enough that her hands were shaking. She did it quietly, without announcement,
Trembling
and
beneath
then
the pressure
she
of
didn't
being
watch.
pressed flat.
A boy watched her anyway. 3 days later he did the same thing. 2 weeks after that, I am still thinking about both. The behavioral science version of this observation is clean. It is documented. I have submitted
This
it.
is Alpha. Target in sight.
It says,
requesting backup.
humans present
Copy,
unusual
Alpha.
group
Got you
resource
fixed.
allocation
Moving on.
patterns inconsistent with
distribution
competitive
tent had
scarcity
been set up
models,
by the
with
VEF
cross-group
Compact
propagation
Logistics
through
team.
observed social learning, with significance for joint force
Follow
integration.
compact protocol.
The clean version is true. It is also approximately the right shape wrapped around entirely the wrong core. What actually happened is not a behavioral pattern. What actually happened is that two people, one an adult soldier, one a 14-year-old orphan, were handed something by someone who came before them, something that wasn't food or equipment or doctrine, something that arrived as a gesture, or a phrase, or a jacket left over 3 sleeping children at midnight, and they received it and they kept it and they passed it on.
Civilians and non-combatants
And
to the
the
rear,
thing did not
prioritized
diminish in
by relative
passing.
utility to ongoing
This is the part
operations.
one cannot put in a grid. When I entered the Compact Sciences program 12 years ago, my field director told me that the purpose of behavioral observation was to identify patterns so that we could predict them. Prediction was the goal.
appropriate channels had thanked me for
Patterns
my
were the
input
mechanism.
and then done absolutely
The data served the model.
nothing.
I have been thinking about whether the data serves the model, or whether the model is there to serve the data, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable place, that the thing I observed in this field post does not want to be predicted. It wants to be transmitted. Not documented. Not modeled. Transmitted.
Before the joint unit even
Received.
arrived in the sector.
Understood from the inside. Passed on by someone who arrived at it themselves. The way Taith arrived at it. The way DOS
Energy
carries it.
signature is right here.
The way a woman in a convoy in the Mireth Pass gave her water away and was killed 3 days later, and her son has been giving things away ever since, not out of grief, not out of performance, not out of survival strategy, out of mathematics. The mathematics that says you are not the only one holding
They
it.
sat in a cluster near
I
the
do not
ring
have a
tent.
word for this in Veth. I have spent 19 days looking for one.
Something's out there.
I have
We
come
need
to
check.
believe we don't have the word because we haven't been practicing the thing long enough to need it.
I'd learned his name.
I would
because he
like
kept
us to
appearing near
practice
my
it.
observation post with a
I would
quality
like
of-
that very much. Transport arrived at 1358. Osek had already loaded both our bags. He is, beneath everything, a relentlessly
No, this
practical
can't be
person,
happening!
and I harbor a deep
Can't be like
uncomplicated
this!
fondness for him that I would never tell him
The way
directly.
the very young and the very
unit
old
was
and
at the
very
vehicle
powerless
pad.
wait, not with
Yasin,
patience.
Farron and Drill were there, Drill standing with his grievance against flat ground posture, looking at the transport with the expression of a person who has already
But with
decided
the
not to have
suspended
feelings
animation,
about
people
goodbyes
would
and
stop
is
expecting
succeeding
things to
approximately
happen on
60%. Doss was there.
I noted.
She shook my hand, which is a human gesture I had not been prepared for in the physical immediacy of it, the specific solid warmth of a grip from someone whose hands I had spent 19 days watching contain a tremor. She shook it once, firmly, without flourish. "Good luck with the report," she said.
On my
It's
mark,
already
advance to
submitted,
the ridge.
I said.
Copy that. Go.
"Good luck with the
Keep
people who
formation,
read
eyes
it."
open.
I appreciated this. It was accurate and it required no elaboration. She stepped
Something
back.
to the soldier ahead of her
A
that made him
second, I
snort
walked
laugh.
toward the transport. I stopped. I turned around. I looked at her, and at Yas behind her, and at the camp behind them, and at the secondary post 12 kilometers west where Taith was probably at his corner with the small ones. "I don't have the word," I said. "For what you do. For what you are."
Or something adjacent.
She
to a
looked at
grin.
me.
The human face
"But
does
I'm
that.
going to look for it,"
Layers
I
things.
said. "And if I find
Where's
it,
five
I'll send it."
expressions over each other like
She held
strata?
my gaze for a moment. "I'll be here," she said. "I am writing this on the transport." Osek is asleep next to me with the complete commitment of someone who has been waiting to sleep for 19 days and will not be shortchanged. I have been awake the whole flight. I have my log. I have the terrible coffee that the transport provided in a standard issue thermos, which I had poured optimistically and which is currently cold. I keep thinking about the word. Veth has many words for giving. Vreth obligatory tribute. Salith exchange with expected return. Miroth sacrifice with documented cost. We are thorough about the mechanisms. We are less thorough
11
about the
days
thing
embedded in
underneath the
field
mechanisms.
operation. It is designed
There
to
are
be
languages
efficient,
I haven't
not
studied.
fair.
Thousands of them.
There it stands, the fortress. of
Compact
our
worlds and non-compact worlds and
We must
places
go.
I've never been.
I understand this in the abstract.
Somewhere, I think, there is a word. A word for, I have something, and you need it, and
had
I am not
apparently
the
not
only one who is
understood
ever
the
holding it,
specific.
and so I am passing it along. A word
The
for,
abstract
this costs me
prioritizing
something real,
combat
and
personnel
that is
ensures
fine,
operational
because the
readiness.
cost is temporary and the giving is permanent. A word for, I am stepping out of the food line. A word for, they eat first. I don't have it yet. I'm working on it. Postscript. 3 weeks after returning to Central Command, I received a message via the Joint Force Courier channel. No name. Secondary post routing code. The message was 4 words, in the flat regional dialect of the Mireth corridor. The boots finally died. Then, after a gap,
Boss had
got
reached
new
the front
ones.
of the line.
Still good. I read it twice. I forwarded it to my personal log. I poured another cup of terrible coffee and sat in my office in Central Command, and I thought about a 14-year-old boy in a jacket that was too large for him, sitting against a wall with 2 small children asleep against his sides, watching a woman across the room who wasn't watching back.
Eyes on the horizon.
I thought about the word I was still looking for.
Looked at him.
I thought, maybe the reason we don't have the word is that the word isn't the point. Maybe the point is just to keep doing it.
I sense movement. In
Maybe that's the whole thing. End of part 3, end of Let Them Eat First, Field Assessment Log, Provisional Attachment, Joint Humanitarian Corridor, Sector 9 Mireth.
Tent pole.
Logged by Subcommander Velathorin, 3rd Behavioral
Tested his
Sciences,
arms
Veth
around the
Compact.
small ones.
Status, closed. Personal notation flag,
Middle-sized ones
active.
Sitting in a row of varying
Will remain
stages of
active.